The nanny slept on the floor with the baby. The billionaire CEO saw it and fell in love with her. Before we begin, comment below and tell us, where are you from? Which city are you watching from? And when it's over, be sure to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. It was a quiet winter night in Telluride, the kind of night where snow seemed to fall in slow motion, blanketing the world in silence. CEO Caleb Whitmore returned to his mountain estate after a long business trip, his mind still buzzing with numbers, deadlines, and deals. He meant to head straight upstairs to his room, but then he stopped. There, on the Persian rug beside the fireplace, glowing with soft golden light, Hannah, the new nanny, lay fast asleep. In her arms, little Sophie was curled up, the two of them wrapped together in a thin blanket. The firelight danced across Hannah's face, tender as a lullaby. Sophie's tiny hand clutched the fabric of Hannah's sweater as if letting go might make the whole world disappear. In that moment, in a house that had only ever known the sound of wind howling through cold windows, Caleb saw something he'd never seen before. The picture of a family. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had been missing it all his life. Detroit. In the middle of a bleak winter rain, hammered the potholed streets, hissing against cracked window panes. In a damp basement apartment, the only light came from a single yellow bulb that flickered as if it too was ready to give up. Hannah Sullivan, 30 years old, sat in a creaking wooden chair, her fingers gripping a sheet of paper stamped with 3 cold, heavy lines. Vacate within 15 days. 3 months overdue. Orphaned at 8. Hannah had grown up within the lonely walls of foster homes, always on the sidelines of someone else's life, like a shadow no one noticed. A few days ago, she had lost her job. No degree, no family, no safety net. Outside, rain fell in a steady rhythm when her phone rang. It was Monica, the one friend she trusted. Her voice was hurried but warm. There's a job in Telluride, Colorado. Live-in nanny and housekeeper for a wealthy CEO. Good pay room included. You just need to know how to care for a child and not be afraid of silence. Hannah stayed quiet for a long time. Telluride was 1,000 miles away, and wealthy CEO sounded like a different planet from where she belonged. But outside her window, the night was cold and choices were few. She nodded, not because she believed it was the start of something beautiful, but because she had nothing left to lose. 2 days later, Hannah stood at the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate, her old suitcase in hand. The stone house rose tall among snow-laden pines, elegant yet so still, it felt almost haunted. The man who opened the door was Caleb Whitmore, 37, founder of a sustainable tech company worth hundreds of millions. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the gray of frozen lakes. In the crook of his arm, he held 9-month-old Sophie, her wide eyes studying Hannah with innocent curiosity. Caleb spoke only once, his voice low and clipped, "I only need quiet." And in that moment, Hannah understood, inside this grand, beautiful house, the distance between them wasn't just measured in money, but in a lifetime of loneliness. Chapter 1. The House Without Laughter. Snow fell so thick that each step Hannah took on the stone path seemed to sink into the silence of the mountains. When her hand touched the heavy wooden door of the Whitmore estate, a strange feeling crawled up her spine. Not quite cold, but the cautious shiver of someone stepping into a world that wasn't theirs. Inside, pale gold light spilled from a chandelier that nearly brushed the ceiling, reflecting off polished hardwood floors. Every footstep Hannah made echoed sharply, as if she were disturbing the stillness itself. Mrs. Langford, the elderly housekeeper with neatly pinned silver hair, led her down a long hallway. The walls were lined with valuable abstract paintings, yet none depicted people. Tall windows were dressed in thick burgundy drapes, shut tight as if to keep out not just the light, but any sound from the outside world. "Your room is upstairs at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7, and..." She paused, lowering her voice. "Mr. Whitmore does not like noise. Remember that." Hannah nodded, pressing her lips together. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that. In many foster homes, there had been similar warnings. Don't bother anyone. Don't draw attention. But here the words seemed to leave an imprint from the very first moment. As they passed the library, Hannah caught sight of Caleb Whitmore. He stood with his back to her, holding Sophie in his arms. The baby wore a white knit dress, cheeks rosy from the cold gray eyes fixed on the high ceiling. That gaze flickered to Hannah for just a second, not shy but curious in the way only very young children could be. Caleb glanced over his shoulder, gave a small nod. "Welcome. Do your job well and keep things quiet." Then he turned away, leaving Hannah standing in a house beautiful as a painting, but cold as stone. Have you ever walked into a place so grand, yet felt like an uninvited guest? If you have, share that feeling in the comments. The chime of the hall clock rang softly at 6:30 a.m., echoing through thick stone walls. Hannah woke earlier than planned, perhaps because the stillness here was so complete, so unlike the rain-soaked nights in Detroit. She washed her face with cold water from a porcelain basin, each drop feeling like it woke a different vein in her body. Descending the wide wooden staircase, she caught the faint scent of fresh coffee and buttery pastries drifting from the main kitchen. Mrs. Langford was already there, apron neatly tied, setting breakfast on the long table. Caleb sat at the head, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, even this early, eyes fixed on his laptop. In the high chair beside him, Sophie sat quietly, her gaze following a beam of golden light from the window. Hannah stepped closer, leaning down. "Good morning, Sophie." The baby didn't cry, didn't smile, only blinked once, as though assessing the stranger in front of her. Hannah smiled back, but her chest tightened. Most children either smile or cry when meeting someone new, but Sophie did neither. Her eyes felt like tiny mirrors reflecting something emptier than innocence. Without looking up, Caleb spoke in a measured tone. "Hannah, after breakfast, help Mrs. Langford tidy the sitting room. Keep everything in its place." His voice was steady, not cold, but without warmth. Each word weighed before being released. Hannah nodded, taking a seat at the far end of the table. She ate little, only nibbling at a slice of bread, discreetly watching Sophie being spoon-fed. The kitchen was magazine-perfect walnut cabinets, marble counters, a wide window looking out on snow-draped pines. But the only sounds were the clink of a spoon and the ticking of the clock. No conversation, no laughter. Hannah thought of the foster homes she'd lived in, places that were far from warm, but still had the noise of a TV, the bark of a dog, the voice of a neighbor calling out. Here, silence felt like an unspoken law, wrapping around even a 9-month-old child. When breakfast ended, Caleb closed his laptop, brushed a perfunctory kiss across Sophie's forehead, more habit than emotion, and left. The faint scent of sandalwood lingered behind him, along with a space at the table that felt bigger than it was. Hannah found herself thinking, this house has everything, except laughter. If you lived in a beautiful house with no warmth at all, would you stay for the safety, or leave to find somewhere you truly belong? Share your answer below. Mrs. Langford handed her a handwritten list of chores: dust the sitting room, arrange the bookshelf, check the table linens. And at the bottom, in smaller writing, Sophie's room, change bedding, wipe down toys. Hannah carried the list down the main hall of the second floor. It was so long that every step echoed back to her, more like walking through a museum than a home. The walls were lined with paintings in muted winter tones, none of them with people. Sophie's door was ajar. Hannah pushed it open gently, greeted by soft light streaming in from a large window. The room was decorated in white cream and pale gold, immaculate, almost too perfect, with no sign a child truly lived there. In the crib, the blanket was folded square, the sheets pulled smooth, the pillow untouched. Toys sat on a shelf like display pieces: a pristine teddy bear, an unopened set of blocks, a spotless rubber ball. She picked up the ball, rolling it in her hand. No scuff marks, no dust. No one had played with it in a long time. She set it back and realized what was missing here wasn't color or objects, but life. From the hallway came the sound of the stroller wheels. Mrs. Langford was pushing Sophie toward the nursery. Hannah stepped out, smiling down. "Want to go in your room, Sophie?" The baby glanced at the door, then back at Hannah. No change in expression. Like this wasn't a place she claimed as her own. Hannah lifted her gently, feeling the small warmth of her body through layers of knit. She set Sophie in the crib, but the baby didn't crawl. didn't reach for toys, just sat turning the button on her sweater between tiny fingers. In that moment, Hannah saw a reflection of herself. In those eyes, the look of a child who had learned early that they were only ever a temporary guest. Children like that don't cry loudly, don't cling, don't demand, because they already understand no one stays for long. Hannah took a slow breath and quietly began changing the sheets, dusting each toy. When she crouched to retrieve a hair clip from under the cabinet, Sophie watched as though wanting to speak, but stayed silent. Do you believe children can feel loneliness before they even learn to speak? Share your thoughts. By noon, winter sunlight slanted through tall windows, laying thin gold strips across the floor. Hannah had just finished cleaning when she noticed the empty frame on Sophie's shelf, polished but without a picture. She hesitated before putting it back. Lunch was ready in the main kitchen: creamy mushroom soup, crisp bread, fresh salad. The aroma was inviting, yet couldn't melt the cold seeping from the stone walls. Caleb sat at the head, Sophie beside him. He'd traded his suit jacket for a white shirt, sleeves rolled neatly, cutting bread with slow precision. He looked up only briefly when Hannah entered, giving a small nod. Mrs. Langford ladled soup into bowls. Sophie accepted the first spoonful, then turned away. Hannah smiled, taking the spoon. "Let me try." The baby's gaze lingered for a second, then her mouth opened. One spoon, then another. Not a smile exactly, but her eyes looked a little less empty than they had earlier. Caleb noticed, though. He said nothing, setting down his knife to watch in silence. Lunch passed with only the sound of cutlery and the clock. No background music, no conversation. The meal felt more like a ritual than a moment to connect. When dessert arrived, Caleb spoke. "I have meetings this afternoon. Sophie will be with you." His tone left no room for questions. Hannah nodded, but silently wondered, on an ordinary day, does this house ever hear laughter? She glanced at Sophie, holding a small cookie crumbs on her tiny fingers. Hannah gently wiped them away, and the child didn't pull back. It was just a moment, but it felt like half a step closer into this quiet little world. If you could change just one small thing in a house to make it feel less lonely, where would you start? Share your idea. The afternoon light in Telluride had a quality all its own: pale gold, soft as silk, yet cold when it touched your skin. Hannah carried Sophie upstairs, her footsteps echoing along the long, wood-paneled hallway. In the playroom at the corner, a large window overlooked the snow-covered pines. Outside, branches swayed in slow arcs, releasing the occasional drifting flake. Hannah spread a soft rug on the floor, sitting with Sophie beside her. She opened a wooden toy box, blocks, animal figures, puzzles. She picked up a red block, placing it in Sophie's hand. "You can stack them, like this." She built a small tower, 1, 2, 3, until it stood eye level with Sophie. The baby reached out, tapped the top block. The tower collapsed with a satisfying clack. And then came the smallest sound, barely more than a breath, a tiny giggle. Hannah froze. That little sound was light as air, yet enough to warm the whole room. She widened her eyes in mock horror. "Oh no, my building fell down. Must have been a mysterious little hand." Sophie covered her mouth, eyes sparkling. Hannah rebuilt the tower slower this time, giving her time to anticipate. The moment the last block was placed, the tiny hand toppled it again. The giggle came louder now, lasting longer. Hannah felt a pang in her chest. She wasn't Sophie's mother, and she didn't know how long she'd stay here. But in this moment, with that laugh, she had cracked a small opening in the wall of silence around this house. Outside, the wind still moved through the pines, but inside, for the first time since she'd arrived, Hannah heard something else: the sound of life. Do you believe a single small smile can change the atmosphere of an entire home? Share a time you witnessed it. The playroom door eased open and a tall figure's shadow fell across the rug. Hannah looked up, block still in hand. Caleb stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. Hall light played over his face, making those gray eyes harder to read. He said nothing, just stood there watching. Sophie, sensing her father's presence, turned her head, but instead of lifting her arms for him, she glanced back at Hannah and reached for another block. Caleb stepped in his shoes, sounding low against the wood. He sat in an armchair at a distance, eyes following every small movement. How Hannah leaned just enough to make Sophie feel safe, how she smiled without rushing as if time here didn't need to run. She laughed. His voice was low, half statement, half question. Hannah nodded. Yes, just a little. But it was real. For a moment, Caleb leaned back as if to hide his reaction. Hannah caught something in his eyes, not pure joy, but a kind of relief laced with regret. He rose, adjusting his cuff. I have a meeting. Continue. Then he left the door, left slightly ajar. But Hannah knew something had shifted between them, just enough to stir the cold walls of this house. If you saw someone guarded suddenly show emotion, would you pretend not to notice or find a way to get closer? Share your answer. Night fell faster in the mountains. From the living room window, Hannah watched the pines turn into tall black silhouettes in the snow. The wind whispered through the gaps in the doors, carrying a faint, eerie hum. Dinner was laid on a walnut table that stretched nearly the length of the room under a chandelier, spilling warm golden light that couldn't quite melt the cold in the stone walls. Caleb at one end, Sophie beside him, Mrs. Langford at the side, and Hannah at the far end, the distance between them so great that conversation would have to be raised. But no one tried. The clink of silverware on china was the loudest sound. Hannah cut into her chicken, glancing at Sophie eating her porridge without fuss. She wanted to speak, to ask Caleb something simple, but his gaze stayed on his wine glass, or on Sophie without words. Finally, she asked quietly, "What's Sophie's favorite food?" Caleb looked up surprised, as if he hadn't expected the question. "I'm not sure. She's too young to say." Hannah pressed her lips together. A father who didn't know his child's favorite food, not out of complete neglect, but because he'd never had the chance to really learn. Mrs. Langford set a breadbasket down her glance, telling Hannah, "Don't try to break the silence here." When dinner ended, Caleb carried Sophie upstairs. His footsteps faded down the hall and the house sank into its thick, familiar quiet. If every meal in your home were silent, would it feel peaceful or suffocating? Be honest. That night, the house was so still Hannah could hear the tick of the clock in her room. Wind rattled faintly at the window branches, tapping against the glass. She sat on the bed, opening an old sewing kit, her fingers working out of habit, while her thoughts wandered back to dinner. This place felt like a showroom, perfect, but missing a soul. Close to midnight, she heard it, a sound so soft it almost didn't reach her ears. Crying. Not the loud wail of a frightened child, but muffled sobs choked back as if not wanting anyone to hear. She rose, stepping into the dim hallway, the golden light reflecting faintly on polished floors. The sound led her to Sophie's room. She hesitated. Mrs. Langford had been clear. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't like anyone entering without permission." But the sound was too familiar, cutting deep, exactly the way she'd cried at 8 years old in a foster bed, certain no one would come. Hannah pushed the door open. Sophie sat up in her crib, clutching a brand new teddy bear, cheeks wet. Her eyes found Hannah's, wordlessly asking, "Is anyone here?" Hannah stepped forward, lifting her gently. "Shh. It's okay. I'm here." The baby nestled into her neck, small fingers clutching her sweater. Hannah stroked her back, feeling that fragile warmth seep into her own skin. She began to hum, not words, just an old lullaby tune she remembered from the orphanage. Sophie's breathing slowed. Hannah didn't put her down. She sat in the armchair by the window, wrapping them both in a thin blanket. Moonlight spilled across the floor, the wind moving through the trees outside, but here, for this moment, they had their own small island of warmth. She knew she was breaking the silence rule of this house, but a child didn't need a perfect home. They needed real arms to hold them. If you heard a stranger crying at night, would you knock or pretend not to hear? Share your choice. The hall clock struck 11 as Caleb returned from a late meeting in town. Snow clung to his coat shoulders, melting into dark patches as he hung it by the door. The house was silent but for the wind. By habit, he checked each room, something he'd done every night since Sophie was born. Nearing her door, he noticed it was ajar with a faint light spilling through. He stepped inside and stopped. Hannah sat in the armchair, head tilted in sleep. Sophie was curled against her, both wrapped in the same blanket. The child's face rested over Hannah's heart. tiny hand gripping her sweater as if letting go might make the warmth disappear. Moonlight washed over them soft and silver. Hannah's hair was slightly mussed, her face bare of makeup, but she looked peaceful. Caleb didn't move forward or back. In that instant, he realized the difference. Hannah hadn't just kept quiet as he'd asked. She had brought something into this house he'd long forgotten how to hold: tenderness. His chest tightened, not from fleeting attraction, but from a deep recognition. This was the picture of a family he thought he could never have again. He stepped closer, quietly reaching for a thicker blanket from the shelf, draping it over them with care. His hand lingered on her shoulder just long enough to feel the truth. Somewhere in this cold house, a corner had begun to warm. Caleb stepped back, closing the door softly. One thought stayed with him as he walked away. Would I have the courage to keep this? If you were Caleb and saw this, would you only smile silently? Or would you step closer and say something, share your honest feeling? Chapter 2. The Night of Fate. That afternoon, snow began to fall heavier than usual. The flakes were big, like pieces of delicate white lace drifting down from the sky, quietly covering the rooftops, the winding paths, and the pines in the distance. In the small but warm secondary kitchen, Hannah stood at the sink, washing porcelain cups, her thoughts drifting in rhythm with the snow outside the window. The shrill ring of the landline broke the stillness. Mrs. Langford answered, listened for a moment, then turned to Hannah. The night nanny's come down with a high fever. She can't make it tonight. I need to go to Denver. My sister's just been admitted to the hospital. Hannah, you'll watch Sophie tonight, yes? Hannah froze, the water still running over her hands. She'd never been alone with Sophie through the night before, but her answer came quickly. Yes, go ahead. I'll take care of her. Mrs. Langford hurried into her coat, leaving a few quick instructions feeding Time's room temperature how to soothe Sophie if she couldn't sleep. Caleb had left for a business trip that morning and wasn't expected back until late. When the door shut, Hannah realized the whole house was now down to just the two of them, her and Sophie. Outside, the light dimmed into the blue-gray of a mountain winter dusk. Hannah climbed to the nursery, finding Sophie lying in her crib, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. She leaned down and smiled. Looks like it's just you and me tonight, little one. Sophie didn't respond, only blinked once, but her tiny hand reached out, instinctively touching Hannah's finger. If you were asked to care for a baby overnight for the first time, would you feel more nervous or excited? Share your thoughts. By now, the sky had sunk fully into deep blue, and the snow kept falling without rest. In the living room, golden light from the wall sconces spread across the Persian rug, the quiet so complete Hannah could hear the soft crack of firewood in the hearth. She had just finished feeding Sophie, changing her into fresh pajamas, and setting her in the stroller near the fire for warmth. At first, Sophie was calm gray eyes quietly scanning the room. But then her lips quivered, and a small whimper slipped out. The whimper grew quickly into real crying, starting like a small wave, then building into something deeper, tearing through the house's heavy silence. Hannah hurried to lift her, holding the baby close. Shh, I'm here. You're okay. You're okay. She tried walking to the window so Sophie could watch the snow rocking her, gently swaying like a small boat on calm water. But the crying didn't stop. Hannah knew this kind of cry. It wasn't hunger or discomfort, it was the sound of a soul feeling unsafe. And in an instant, memory flooded back. She was 8 years old again on her first night in the orphanage. She'd buried her face in the pillow, biting her lip to keep from sobbing aloud, because she already knew no one would come. Her chest tightened. Without thinking, Hannah sank to the rug right in front of the fire, wrapping Sophie and herself in one blanket. She held her close, letting the baby feel her heartbeat and the steady warmth of her chest. Almost without realizing it, Hannah began to hum no words, just the slow, familiar lullaby an old caretaker used to hum to her in those brief years at the orphanage. The melody was simple, unhurried, like the snow falling outside. Gradually, the crying softened. The sobs broke into smaller hiccups. Sophie's body relaxed, her tiny fingers unclenching, until they found the hem of Hannah's sweater and held on. Hannah didn't put her back in the crib. Instead, she shifted so Sophie could lie fully against her chest, warmth passing from one body to the other. She leaned her head back against the armchair, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. For the first time in years, Hannah felt she herself was being lulled to sleep. Do you believe that sometimes to soothe a soul, no words are needed, only an embrace that lasts long enough? Share your story. The hum of an SUV engine rolled up the stone driveway, mixing with the sound of wind through the trees. Hannah was still half dreaming, Sophie breathing softly against her. The great wooden front door opened, bringing with it a rush of cold air. Caleb stepped inside, dusted with snow. He set his black shoes on the polished wood, hung his coat, and by long habit walked toward the living room to check in before going upstairs. His steps slowed when the glow of the fireplace revealed something he had not expected to see. On the Persian rug before the fire, Hannah sat leaning against the armchair, her head tilted slightly, hair loose. Sophie was asleep in her arms, face nestled against her chest, one tiny hand still clutching Hannah's sweater. They were wrapped together in a single thin blanket, the warmth between them soft as a halo in the quiet room. Caleb stood still. The sound of wind snow travel had all receded. All he saw was this. It was so simple, and yet so absent from this house for so long that it hurt. He remembered nights when he'd stayed awake holding Sophie as a newborn, but his hands then had been clumsy, his heart heavy with loss. Tonight felt different. Something in this room had changed. This wasn't the image of a nanny doing her job. This was someone choosing to stay until a child felt safe. Caleb bent down, took a thicker blanket from the armchair, and stepped quietly closer. He draped it over both of them, his hand resting a moment on Hannah's shoulder, light enough not to wake her. And in that moment, something stirred in his chest. Warmth he had once believed was gone forever. He didn't speak, didn't wake her. Just stepped back, stood for a few seconds more, committing the scene to memory, then left, closing the door, without a sound. If you stumbled upon a moment this peaceful and beautiful, would you keep it to yourself? Or let them know you'd seen it? Share your answer. Chapter 3. Cracks in the cold wall. Winter light streamed into the dining room through tall windows, carrying the sharp chill of morning with it. Hannah had been there since the clock struck 6:45, wearing a simple cream sweater, her hair pulled into a low tie, helping Mrs. Langford set the table and pour coffee. Sophie sat in her high chair, her baby hair sticking out in soft tufts from sleep, looking perfectly content. She was tapping a wooden spoon against the tray, the sound clunk, clunk, steady and small. Caleb walked in still in his immaculate suit, but his steps were slower than usual. And for the first time in a long time, his eyes didn't go to the open laptop waiting for him at the table. They went to Hannah. She was leaning down, wiping Sophie's tiny hands with a warm cloth, speaking to her in that gentle, steady tone that seemed to slow time itself. You slept well last night, didn't you? No bad dreams this time. Sophie didn't answer, of course. But she smiled just a little and shook her spoon. Hannah smiled back, not wide, not forced, but warm enough to reach even someone standing several feet away, trying to keep his face unreadable. Caleb pulled out his chair, quietly watching. He noticed that Hannah's hands never rushed. Every movement carried a patience so rare in his world. Everyone around him was always hurrying, assistants, partners, board members, all running against the clock. But here, Hannah gave every second to make Sophie feel seen. Mrs. Langford poured his coffee, but his eyes stayed on the far end of the table where Hannah was carefully placing a small slice of bread on Sophie's blue plate, as if it were the most important meal in the world. If one day you found yourself noticing someone's smallest gestures, would you call that change? Share your thoughts. After breakfast, Mrs. Langford took Sophie upstairs to change. Hannah stayed to clear the table. Caleb remained in his seat, coffee cooling in front of him, laptop open but untouched. He watched her gather plates, dab at a milk spill on the tablecloth, bend to pick up the spoon Sophie had dropped. Every action was light, deliberate, as if everything in this house deserved care. He realized he'd forgotten how that felt. Hannah passed behind him, the faint scent of fresh laundry soap trailing after her. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Caleb understood something. Last night hadn't only changed Sophie, it had changed him too. For months he hadn't noticed anyone who worked here. They came, did their jobs, and left. But with Hannah, it was different. She wasn't just working here, she was present. The memory of the night before flickered in his mind, the firelight on her face, Sophie in her arms, the stillness that felt warmer than anything he'd known in years. He hadn't expected to carry that image into morning, but he had. When Hannah disappeared down the hallway, he found his gaze following her, not consciously, but without stopping himself either. This wasn't simple curiosity. It was more like someone standing in a dark room for years and suddenly seeing a sliver of light and feeling an instinct to move toward it. He tried to focus on the emails waiting on his screen, but his fingers paused over the keys and his ears tuned instead to the faint sound of Hannah laughing at something Sophie had done down the hall. And Caleb wondered, when did that laugh start making this house feel less cold? Have you ever caught yourself quietly looking for someone's presence even when they're not in the same room? Tell me about it. That afternoon, Caleb left his office to refill his coffee. He wasn't looking for Hannah, but Sophie's cry drew him to the playroom. The little girl sat on the rug, cheeks flushed, tears streaking down. A yellow block had rolled away. The tower she'd been building collapsed. Hannah sat across from her, not scooping her up right away, but lowering herself to Sophie's level, speaking softly, her voice warm as the fire. "It's okay. We can try again. Look, I'll help you build it back." She picked up the blocks, one by one, slowly enough for Sophie to follow. When only the last block remained, Hannah placed it in Sophie's hands. "Your turn. I know you can do it." Sophie looked from the block to Hannah, maybe not fully understanding, but her little hands reached up and set it on top. This time the tower stood. Hannah smiled, not cheering loudly, not exaggerating, just said softly, "See, you did it." From the doorway, Caleb watched the whole thing. He was used to solving problems quickly, step in, fix it, move on. But Hannah chose differently. She let Sophie experience the small triumph for herself. There was something in that patience, quiet, unshowy, that made it harder for him to look away than any polished success story he'd ever heard. It was a softness that slipped through cracks even in walls he thought were unbreakable. What do you think of Hannah's choice to let Sophie do it herself? Has anyone in your life been that patient with you? Later, the snow stopped for a while and weak winter light filtered through the high windows. Caleb came downstairs with a folder in hand, heading for the door to make a call. But passing the living room, he paused. Hannah sat in the armchair, Sophie in her lap wrapped in a beige knit blanket. The baby's small fingers played with the yarn like it was a secret treasure. Hannah was telling her a simple story about a little rabbit finding its way home, her voice low and rhythmic like waves lapping a quiet shore. Caleb stood at the doorway watching, and for some reason the call could wait. The numbers could wait. The light caught in Hannah's soft brown hair, giving it a faint halo. She didn't know he was there. She kept reading sometimes, pressing a small kiss to the crown of Sophie's head, a gesture so natural, so uncalculated. He realized he'd been standing there longer than necessary. Clearing his throat, he stepped in, keeping his voice even. "She asleep?" Yet Hannah looked up a little startled. "Almost. Just a few more minutes." He nodded, but his gaze lingered a beat longer than it should have. And he knew it, the ice around him was starting to crack. Have you ever stood still just to hold on to a peaceful moment a little longer? Share your story. The next morning, Caleb's schedule was relentless, back-to-back meetings, endless calls. But somehow, he found himself leaving his desk more often, to get water, to check the first-floor windows. Almost every time those steps led him to where Hannah was. In the morning, he stopped in the hall when he heard soft laughter from the playroom. Through the open door, Hannah knelt beside Sophie, fitting puzzle pieces together. When Sophie placed one correctly, Hannah tapped her tiny hand in a high five. Sophie giggled, bright and free, echoing down the hall. Caleb, for reasons he couldn't explain, smiled too. At lunch, he wandered to the kitchen for fresh coffee, even though his cup was still full. There, Hannah was teaching Sophie to clap along to a nursery song. The baby's small hands were clumsy but determined, trying to match Hannah's rhythm. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, silent, just listening. He began to notice that the smallest things, a laugh, a half-sung tune, Sophie's eyes, seeking Hannah, moved him more than any multi-million-dollar contract. And he wondered, had he been looking for these moments all along without realizing? Do you believe big changes often begin with small things? What small thing once changed you? By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dull gray warning of another snowstorm. Caleb had just ended a long, draining video call when, without thinking, his feet took him not to the kitchen, but to the living room. Hannah sat on the floor with Sophie in her lap, flipping through a thick picture book. "This is a cat. Can you hear the cat meow? Meow." Sophie laughed, waving her little hands. Hannah laughed, with her eyes soft with the kind of affection that asked for nothing in return. Caleb leaned in the doorway, and the thought came clear and simple. This house has laughter again. Not from a playlist, not from rare parties, but from his daughter, and from the woman who had been quietly, patiently giving it back to her. A strange feeling rose in his chest, not a spark of sudden attraction, but a need. He wanted to see this again, to walk into this room and find them here, to let the house once filled only with wind and ticking clocks stay full of these sounds. When Hannah looked up and caught his gaze, he covered the moment with a comment. "She's making progress fast." Hannah smiled. "If someone's there for her long enough, she'll learn quickly." The words slid past his guard, sharp and precise. He didn't answer, just nodded, but inside he knew this wall he'd built for years was showing cracks too wide to hide. If one simple sentence touched you deeply, would you pretend it didn't, or let it change you? Share your thoughts. Dinner was simpler than usual. Chicken soup, fresh bread, a small salad. Caleb sat at the head of the table, Hannah across, Sophie in between. Normally, Caleb ate quickly, treating dinner like a pit stop before returning to work. But tonight he ate slower. Not because the menu had changed, but because he'd begun noticing the small moments around the table. Hannah broke the bread into tiny pieces for Sophie, sometimes wiping crumbs from her cheeks. Sophie held out a piece to her, in return a clumsy little offering. Hannah pretended to take a big bite, then laughed. Sophie laughed too, mouthful. Caleb found it hard to look away. He realized he was letting the minutes stretch, ignoring the pings of incoming emails, ignoring tomorrow's reports. When dinner ended, he didn't get up right away. He stayed to watch Hannah carry Sophie to the living room. The baby's head rested on her shoulder, eyes heavy with sleep. Hannah hummed softly, her voice low and gentle, as though the wrong volume could break the spell. Caleb followed, leaning against the doorway in silence. For a fleeting moment, he imagined this as an every-night thing, not a passing scene, but their life. The thought didn't scare him. It pulled at him. Have you ever wished a moment could slow down just so you could stay in it a little longer? Tell me about that time. After Sophie was asleep, Hannah returned to tidy the toys left on the rug. Caleb sat by the fire jacket, off a mug of coffee in hand, but untouched. When she bent to pick up a stuffed rabbit, his voice came lower than usual. "She's never laughed this much before." Hannah paused, looking up. Children just need to feel safe. Once they believe they won't be left, the smiles come on their own. He was quiet, but his gray eyes stayed on hers. Not assessing, not polite, just seeing. When her gaze dropped, she noticed a small brown teddy bear on the table beside him, brand new tag still on. "I picked it up on the way home," he said when he saw her looking. "Thought she might like it." She held the bear, surprised not by its value, but by the fact that this man who once demanded only efficiency and quiet was beginning to notice things like this. "I think she'll love it," Hannah said, smiling softly. The pause that followed wasn't strained, just the fire crackling and something shifting between them, quiet but undeniable. "Do you think a small act at the right moment can change how we see someone?" Share your answer. Hannah set the teddy bear beside his chair, the firelight painting its fur gold. She was turning away when Caleb spoke. "That night, when I came home, I saw you and Sophie asleep by the fire." Her hand stilled on the toy block she was holding. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I've never seen her sleep that peacefully," he went on. "And I've never seen this house feel that warm. The air between them grew still. Caleb's eyes no longer cold, no longer distant. In them was a truth he hadn't spoken to anyone. He'd been lonelier than he realized. And that became clear only in that moment. Hannah's pulse quickened, but she held her voice steady. I just did what I thought anyone would do. Caleb shook his head slightly. Not everyone would. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other, not boss and employee, not two strangers sharing a roof, but two people who'd built walls around themselves, and suddenly saw a glimpse of the other's unguarded side. And in that space, a thin but steady thread formed between them. If someone looked at you and truly saw you, would you hold their gaze, or turn away, share your answer? The next morning, Caleb was supposed to join a video conference with New York. Normally, he would have left early for his private office in town, but today he sat in the library, laptop open, phone at his side, and didn't log in. Through the crack in the door came the sound of quiet laughter from the playroom, Hannah reading aloud, Sophie babbling in reply. The sound filled the house, breaking the stillness he had once called normal. He checked the time. If he left now, he'd make it to the office in time. But he stayed, listening. When Hannah passed the library with Sophie in her arms, Caleb pretended to read a file, but his eyes followed them until they disappeared down the hall. He realized he was no longer finding reasons to go out as much. Instead, he was finding reasons to stay. That night, when dinner ended, he lingered at the table listening to Hannah talk with Mrs. Langford about Sophie's favorite foods. Every time Hannah laughed, he found it harder to look away. Later, while Hannah carried Sophie upstairs, Caleb stayed in the living room watching the fire flicker. He didn't know how to explain it, but he knew this house wasn't the same anymore, and neither was he. If a place that was once just a house started to feel like home because of one person, would you admit it to yourself? Share your answer. Chapter 4. The conversation in the library. That afternoon, the snow was still falling lighter now, each flake drifting like pale dust through the air outside the windows. Hannah was dusting the upstairs hallway when something unusual caught her eye. The door to the library was ajar. Since the day she'd arrived, she'd passed this room countless times, and it had always been shut tight, a private corner of the house that seemed off limits. Mrs. Langford had once told her, "Don't go into the library unless you're invited. The master considers it his private space." But today, the door stood open, and from inside came the faint sound of pages turning, the scent of old oak shelves mingled with the deep, rich aroma of coffee. Hannah hesitated at the threshold, then knocked lightly. The door opened wider, revealing a high-ceilinged room paneled in dark wood, the shelves stretching up to meet the beams. A small ladder leaned against one of them. By the tall window at a wide desk, Caleb stood. He looked up, not with his usual cool reserve, but with something almost curious. "Do you like to read?" The question caught her off guard. She nodded softly. "Yes, if I have the time." He tilted his head slightly. "What kind of books?" Her gaze drifted around the room. Without thinking, her hand brushed the worn spine of an old novel. Her voice slowed as if weighing the words. "The kind of stories where the forgotten ones are finally loved." The words hung in the stillness between them. Caleb's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a quiet effort to understand. If someone asked you what kind of story you love most and you only had one sentence to answer, what would you say? Share it below. Caleb leaned against the edge of the desk, idly turning a fountain pen in his fingers. Afternoon light spilled through the tall window, casting a narrow beam across the floor and brushing faint gold against his face. And why those stories? His tone was low, deliberate, as if her answer mattered more than $1 million meeting. Hannah kept her eyes on the floorboards, tracing the grain with her gaze. Because in them, the ones no one thought to remember still find someone who stays. Not out of obligation, but because they want to. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes stayed on her. The sentence had struck something in him, an old and closed-off corner filled with the memory of those who had left and the nights when the only sound in the house was his own breathing. When she finally looked up, she found him still watching her. The space between them was just wide enough to keep them from touching, yet close enough that she could feel she was being listened to, truly listened to. In books, she went on, they usually have to go through a lot of loss before they get there. But maybe that's what makes the ending worth it. There was a pause, deep and still. Then Caleb set the pen down, straightened, and said quietly, "Thank you for telling me that." No explanation, no change of subject. Just those words. Enough to make Hannah feel that this short exchange would linger far longer than she expected. Do you believe a conversation that lasts only a few sentences can still change the way you see someone share a time it happened to you? That night, after Sophie was sound asleep, Hannah returned to her small upstairs room. Everything was as neat and quiet as usual, except for one thing. On her pillow lay a book. The cover was a faded blue-gray, its spine worn, carrying the faint scent of old paper Persuasion by Jane Austen. She stopped in the doorway, her heart skipping. Walking closer, she ran her fingers gently over the cover. On the first page there was no inscription, no note, only a slim wooden bookmark carved with delicate leaves. She didn't need anyone to tell her who had left it. Hannah sat on the bed, turning the first few pages. The warm glow of the lamp lit the familiar opening lines, and as she read, she felt as if she had just been given a quiet whisper. "I heard you today. No note, no flowers, no show of grandeur, just a book." But for Hannah, someone unaccustomed to receiving anything without conditions, it was a gift heavier in meaning than anything expensive. A smile touched her lips, not bright, but real and lasting longer than she expected. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines. Inside, in this small corner room, another crack had opened in the cold walls surrounding this house. If someone gave you a gift with no words attached, would you wonder about its meaning, or simply accept it, share how you'd feel? The next morning, Hannah came down to the kitchen earlier than usual. She brewed the coffee, its scent filling the quiet space. As she stacked dishes, she heard the slow, steady sound of footsteps in the hall. Caleb appeared in the doorway, still perfectly dressed. Ty nodded. He gave a small nod. "Good morning." She smiled lightly. "Good morning." Neither mentioned Persuasion, neither asked, neither explained. But when their eyes met, Hannah could feel something wordless between them, a shared, quiet secret. While Mrs. Langford busied herself with breakfast, Caleb poured coffee into a mug and stood across the counter from her. "Sleep well?" he asked, as if it were nothing unusual. She nodded, though she knew the truth. She'd slept not just from the day's fatigue, but because she'd fallen asleep holding that book like a child, clutching the first thing that truly felt like hers. Before he left the kitchen, he glanced her way, his gray eyes catching a faint light that hadn't been there before. Only for a few seconds. But long enough for Hannah to know some gifts don't need words, because everything worth saying is already in the look. If you and someone else shared a silent secret that was never spoken aloud, do you think it would make your bond stronger? Share your thoughts. Chapter 5. The invitation to collaborate. That morning, Hannah was in the back kitchen lining up jars of spices when Mrs. Langford appeared in the doorway. "The master would like to see you, in his study." Hannah stilled her fingers, resting on the lid of a glass jar. She had never been formally summoned to Caleb's study before. The room was tucked into the far corner of the second floor, its tall windows opening onto a view of snow-laden pines. When Hannah stepped inside, Caleb was standing beside a long table, neatly stacked files spread before him. Afternoon light slipped through thin curtains, laying a pale gold wash over the dark wood. He motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him. "I want to talk to you about a new project," he said, his voice steady and low. "An app for single mothers, a place they can find legal support, connect with a community, and access trustworthy information." Hannah frowned slightly, unsure why he was telling her this. "I don't think I know much about technology," he shook his head. "I'm not looking for an engineer. I'm looking for someone who knows what this would mean. Someone who understands what it feels like to be left behind, and knows what would actually help." The words stilled her. His gaze in that moment didn't belong to a CEO hiring an employee. It was the gaze of someone placing real trust in her. If someone trusted you with something big, even if you'd never done it before, would you say yes or no, and why? Hannah agreed, though, A faint unease lingered as she sat before Caleb's laptop for the first virtual meeting. On the screen, boxes filled with faces, programmers, UX designers, community lawyers, all speaking in a language of technical shorthand she'd never heard. Caleb made a brief introduction. "This is Hannah. She'll be advising the team from a real-world user perspective." There were nods and polite greetings. Hannah smiled in return, her hands tightening in her lap. For the first 20 minutes, she only listened, filling pages of her small notebook with unfamiliar terms, UI, back-end user flow, feeling like she was on foreign ground. Then a designer presented a colorful button-filled sample interface. Caleb turned to her. "Hannah, what do you think?" She hesitated. "I think it might be too busy. Most single mothers I've met use older phones. They're often holding a child in one arm and using the other to navigate. The simpler the design, the better." Silence. For a moment, she thought she'd misstepped. But then the designer nodded. "That makes sense. I'll try a stripped-down version." For the first time, Hannah felt a few pairs of eyes on the screen were truly listening. Inside her, a small, steady flame began to glow. Caleb's head tilted just slightly, his eyes saying what his mouth didn't. "See, I told you, you have something to give." Do you remember the first time your opinion was truly heard? How did it feel? By the third meeting a week later, Hannah was no longer perched at the edge of Caleb's desk. He had prepared a spot for her, a laptop ready past meeting notes neatly stacked at her side. When the group began discussing a user forum feature a developer suggested requiring profile photos for authenticity, Hannah's head lifted at once. "I think that's exactly why some people won't join." Silence again. She took a breath and continued. "There are single mothers escaping abusive situations. They don't want to share their image or identity, but they still need help. If we make photos mandatory, we shut out the people who need us most." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the deep voice of the community lawyer came through one of the boxes. "She's right. In victim support work, anonymity is often a matter of survival." The lead developer nodded and typed a note. "Okay. We'll add a full anonymity option to the forum." Caleb said nothing right away. But when the conversation moved on, he leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I trust you." It was a simple sentence, but it moved through her like warm water sinking into places she hadn't realized were cold. Has anyone ever told you, "I trust you," in a way that you felt deep down share that moment? After the meeting, Hannah closed her laptop and gathered her notes. Caleb stayed seated, fingers tapping lightly against the edge of a file, his gaze following her longer than usual. It wasn't the look of a CEO toward an employee, nor just gratitude for a job done well. In his eyes there was recognition and something more, as though he'd just found a piece that had been missing. As she reached the doorway, he spoke without quite meaning to. "You know, this project started as something I wanted to build to help. But until today, I was only seeing it from above. Now I'm starting to see it from the inside." Hannah paused, turning back with a puzzled look. "And what do you see from the inside?" His reply came without hesitation. "I see that without someone like you, it will never reach the people who need it most." The words stopped her. She'd grown used to contributing without being noticed, to working quietly, replaceable at any moment. But here she was standing in a sunlit room, hearing a man who rarely let anyone in admit that her presence was irreplaceable. Hannah only nodded, a small smile curving her lips, and stepped out, carrying that sentence with her like something that would echo for a long time. Caleb watched her go and knew this change wasn't just in the project. It had already begun inside him. If someone who once kept their distance told you that you were an essential part of what they valued, how would you feel? Share your thoughts. Chapter 6. A Figure from the Past. That afternoon, Hannah left Caleb's study with a folder of project notes in hand, her mind still carrying the quiet warmth of his words from the day before, "I trust you." The upstairs hallway was as still as always, the only sound the winter wind whispering through the seams of the old windows. But as she passed by the half-open door to the study, she heard voices. Not Mrs. Langford's, not anyone from the development team. A woman's voice, low, soft, touched with something like longing. "I just wanted to see her for a moment. And to see you." Hannah's steps slowed. One more step, and the scene inside fixed itself in her vision. Rachel. Hannah had seen her face before, frozen in a framed photograph that lay face down on the table beside Sophie's crib. Now Rachel was here in the flesh, holding Sophie close, her golden hair brushing the child's cheek. Caleb stood across from them, neither stepping closer nor pulling away. Sophie didn't cry. She didn't glance toward the doorway where Hannah stood. She only nuzzled into Rachel's shoulder, quiet in a way that felt practiced, familiar. Hannah's grip tightened around the folder in her hands. A chill spread from her fingertips to her chest, not from the draft at the window, but from a truth that came swiftly and without mercy. Between Caleb and Rachel ran a thread she could never touch. She took a single step back, careful to make no sound. But her heart had already begun to retreat. If you saw someone you cared for standing with the person from their past, would you step in or walk away? Share your answer. Back in her room, Hannah shut the door softly, as though afraid of waking something fragile that lived in this house. The folder was still in her hand, but the neat lines of notes inside felt suddenly meaningless. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the thickening snow. The flakes fell heavier now, big wet clusters dropping straight as if in a hurry to bury everything. Somewhere in the distance, Sophie's laughter carried faintly through the walls. It wasn't the same laugh from the morning when she'd been on the rug stacking blocks with Hannah. This laugh was different. The sound a child makes in her mother's arms. A fact settled into Hannah's mind with the cold, unshakable weight of truth. She had never belonged here, and she never would. She opened the desk drawer, pulled out a sheet of paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, but the lines stayed straight. Thank you for letting me feel useful even for a little while. Sophie is a miracle. I wish the two of you happiness always. No signature. Nothing to mark it but her handwriting. She folded the letter and placed it on the small kitchen table downstairs where Caleb would be sure to see it. Then quietly she began to pack a single suitcase, a wooden box of sewing needles, a few changes of clothes. Not much, but everything she had. When she opened the front door, the wind hit her full in the face, flinging snow into her hair. She gripped the handle of the suitcase and stepped down the icy stone steps. Each step thudded in her chest, not from fear, but from the resolve of leaving before she could be left behind. If you knew you would never be chosen, would you leave first to keep your pride intact? Share your thoughts. The road from Whitmore House stretched pale and dim under the storm. The only light came from the tall lamps at the front gates, casting gold onto the restless snow. Each of Hannah's footprints was quickly swallowed by fresh flakes, erasing her path as though she'd never walked it. She pulled her collar high, the wind lashing her cheeks until they stung. The wheels of her suitcase grated against the frozen gravel, their sound mixing with the lonely howl of the storm. No one stopped her. No one called her name. And that, at least on the surface, made it easier to go. At the gates, she paused for a heartbeat, looking back at the house. Its windows glowed warm against the white night. Somewhere in there, Sophie was probably sleeping in someone else's arms. Caleb was perhaps still with Rachel, speaking words Hannah had never been close enough to hear. She took a long breath, turned, and pushed the gate open. It closed behind her with a soft metallic groan, and then the snow closed around her, swallowing her figure into the dark. Inside the house, it wasn't until the gates shut that Caleb came down to the kitchen. He reached for a glass of water, but his eyes fell immediately on the folded paper waiting on the table. He opened it, reading each short line. When his gaze reached Sophie is a miracle, his fingers tightened around the page until the paper creased. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, Caleb, a space had opened deep, cold, and more sudden than he would have believed. If you were Caleb standing in the kitchen with that letter in your hand on a snowy night, would you go after her or stay still? Why? Chapter 7. Thread and Grace. The snowstorm in Telluride was now nothing more than a white blur in Hannah's memory. The overnight bus carried her west into a damp Portland morning. Bare maple branches lined the streets, their silhouettes vanishing into fog that clung to every bus window. The terminal wasn't crowded. People hurried past with their coats pulled tight, splashing through puddles left by last night's rain. Hannah wheeled her suitcase toward the exit, one hand clutching a small wooden sewing box, the one thing she had carried through every place she'd called home. She found a room in East Portland, barely 200 square feet. Low ceiling. white walls already turning yellow at the corners. But the window opened toward the branches of a leafless tree, one she knew would turn green in the spring. It was enough. Her first day was spent simply unpacking. Clothes hung neatly on the single hook behind the door, the suitcase tucked into the corner, the sewing box placed on the windowsill so the morning light could fall across it. That night, Hannah made a cup of ginger tea and sat on the bed watching the rain slide down the street outside. Here, no one knew her name. No one knew Caleb or Sophie or the house buried under Colorado snow. And in that moment, the silence, though lonely, held its own kind of comfort. If you started over in a place where no one knew you, would you feel free? Or lost? Share your thoughts? On her third day in Portland, Hannah opened the wooden sewing box. Inside was everything she had kept since she was 15, an old pair of scissors, a round red pin cushion, worn spools of thread in many colors, and a few scraps of fabric. She laid a square of cotton on the small table by the window. Her hand hesitated, not from cold, but from the feeling of touching a part of herself she had hidden for too long. The needle slipped through the cloth. Thread followed stitch after careful stitch. She was making a small fabric pouch, not for an order not to sell, just to remember she still knew how to create something with her own hands. With each pull of the thread, her breathing slowed. Her heart eased. Images from Telluride came: warm kitchens, Sophie's babbling voice, Caleb's quiet nod when she'd done something right. The memories no longer tore her open. They lay there like an old spool of thread, still wound but no longer choking tight. When the pouch was finished, she set it on the windowsill. Portland's gray light filtered through the fabric, outlining each careful stitch. And for the first time since leaving, she felt she had completed something whole. When you return to something that once made you happy but had been set aside for years, what's the first feeling? Relief, excitement, or fear? Tatorinam. One weekend afternoon, Hannah wandered through Alberta Square, where handmade stalls lined the sidewalk under the bare trees. The scent of roasting coffee mingled with sweet waffle batter. She stopped at a table of embroidered scarves, her eyes tracing each soft thread like a familiar language. The seller, an older woman, smiled. "Making something with your own hands is a beautiful thing, you know. No one can copy every stitch exactly." The words followed Hannah home. That night, she sat at her table looking at the pouch she had sewn and thought, maybe it's time I let other people see what I can do. She opened her old laptop and searched how to register for a stall at the weekend market. In the shop name field, she paused for a long time before typing thread and grace. Thread for the stitches that joined together the loose pieces of her life. Grace for the rare kindness life had shown her, and now for what she hoped to give herself. When the registration confirmed, she smiled to herself. It wasn't a destination yet, but it was a first step down a road she had chosen. If you had to name your new chapter in life, what word would you choose and why? Saturday morning was cold, but dry. Hannah wore a knit cap and scarf, pulling a small suitcase behind her to Alberta Square. Inside were the pouches, handkerchiefs, and embroidered tote bags she'd spent the last 3 weeks making. Her booth sat at the far end near the coffee cart and waffle stand. She laid a white cloth over the old wooden table and arranged her work. Each item carried a handwritten tag, thread, and grace. At first, people passed by with only a glance. Hannah wasn't discouraged. She knew it took time for strangers to pause. Then an elderly woman stopped. She picked up a handkerchief, her fingers stroking the stitches. "You sew beautifully. These stitches, they feel like someone put their whole story into them." Hannah smiled and thanked her. The woman bought 2 pressing folded bills into Hannah's hand. Before she left, she turned back. "Keep going. Don't stop." When Hannah's fingers closed around that first Portland sale, a strange warmth bloomed inside, not for the money, but for what it proved she could exist here, supported by nothing but her own hands. By the end of the day, she'd sold several more. As the sun turned gold, she sat alone at her table, suitcase lighter, now heart fuller than it had been in months. For the first time in a long while, she felt she was walking in the right direction. Do you remember the first time you earned money from your own work and passion? How did it feel? In the weeks that followed, Thread and Grace began to draw regulars. A college student who bought tote bags for her books. A middle-aged man who brought his worn jacket for Hannah to repair. Each time they returned, Hannah felt as though she was building a small bridge back to the world. At night, she sat under the yellow lamp needle and thread moving slowly through fabric. In a small notebook, she wrote, "Today, I am still here, still working, still breathing." She didn't know what Caleb's life looked like now, but sometimes in the rhythm of her new days, Sophie's image slipped in small hands, quick laughter, trusting eyes. The memories no longer unraveled her, but they still made her set the needle down and sit quietly for a while. In Telluride, the Whitmore house was quieter now. Too quiet. There was no bright laugh to greet each morning. Sophie often woke fussy, harder to soothe. Rachel had left after only a few days, leaving Caleb with an absence too sharp to ignore. At night, he found himself in the living room standing before the fireplace. He could see it in his mind as clearly as if it were still there. Hannah asleep. Sophie curled in her arms beneath a thin blanket. He would stand there unmoving, letting the image fill the silence. And each time he knew no one could fill that space in quite the same way she had. If leaving is the only way to find yourself again, but the memories still cling, what would you do to keep moving forward? Share your answer. Chapter 8. The empty space in Telluride. Snow still covered Telluride, but for Caleb, winter had taken on a different weight. Before the season meant discipline, early mornings, runs around the property, hours of back-to-back virtual meetings. Now every morning began with Sophie's cries. There was no soft hum of Hannah's voice coming from the kitchen, no steaming coffee waiting at the table. Sophie ate less than before, and each time he tried to feed her, she turned away, her damp eyes, searching for someone else. Caleb began to realize how much of Hannah had seeped into every corner of this house so deeply that without her, everything felt off balance. Passing through the living room, he would pause at the fireplace. The Persian rug still held the faint indentation where Hannah once sat, cradling Sophie on that snowy night. Just a small hollow in the weave. Yet it was a scar in his memory. He had once believed life could return to what it was before she arrived. But now he knew it never could. The house could not go back because he couldn't. If someone once made your space feel alive and then left, would you try to fill that space or leave it untouched to remember them? Share your thoughts. In the days that followed, Caleb realized Hannah was still here, not in person, but in the quiet imprints she had left. In the kitchen, the spice jars were still lined up in the order she preferred: salt, pepper, basil, cinnamon. She'd once said it made cooking easier when you were in a rush. He'd thought about changing it back, but never did. The small blue pillow still sat slightly askew on the armchair where she used to read to Sophie. More than once he'd reached out to straighten it, only to pull his hand back, afraid to erase the last trace of her. Even the smallest details carried her shadow. The ivory mug she favored still sat in the top cupboard. The tin of cookies remained untouched. Hannah had bought them for Sophie, but now the child would only pick one up, then set it down untouched. Caleb began to understand that absence wasn't just about what you could no longer see. It was the way it seeped into your habits, your movements, until life itself lost its rhythm. One evening, searching his desk for a file, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor. Hannah's handwriting, an old shopping list: milk, oatmeal, soft wipes. The letters slanted neat. He sat there for a long time, holding the paper, feeling as if she'd only just left yesterday. Do you have something in your home that reminds you so strongly of someone gone that you can't throw it away? What is it? That night, snow fell again, thick and silent, just like the evening Hannah left. Caleb sat alone in the library, firelight flickering against the dark wood. On the table lay the letter she'd left. The folds were softer now, the creases worn from being opened too many times. He'd told himself this emptiness was temporary, that time would fill the space. But the harder he tried to forget, the clearer it became. Hannah had never just been Sophie's caretaker or a partner on the app project. She had brought warmth into this house, and to him she'd given something he had forgotten. He needed the feeling of being truly seen and trusted, not for his position, not for his wealth, but for who he was beneath it all. How could he teach Sophie about love, about valuing those who stay, if he let the one person who mattered most walk away without trying? He rose, picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts. Finding her wouldn't be easy. She'd left no address, and Portland was a big city. But one thing was certain this time. Silence and distance wouldn't be his answer. Glancing toward the armchair by the fire, the place she'd once held Sophie as the snow fell, he whispered a promise meant for no one else's ears. I'll find you. Not because I need someone to work for me, but because I need you. If the person you needed most had walked away, would you cross any distance to bring them back? Or would you wait for them to return? Share your answer. The next morning, Caleb stopped at the town grocery store one Hannah had often visited. The owner, Mrs. Grant, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Whitmore, rare to see you out here." "I'm looking for Hannah," he said simply. "She worked for me." Mrs. Grant thought for a moment. Oh, the thin brunette who always bought organic milk and rice crackers. The day she left, I saw her board a bus to Portland. Stopped here to buy some embroidery thread and new needles. Embroidery thread. The word struck a chord. Caleb remembered the small wooden sewing box she kept as if it were treasure. Back at the house, he pulled old project files from a drawer, records from the app meetings. In one email from her personal account, he noticed the automatic signature Thread and Grace, Portland OR. He turned to his laptop, typing the name into a search bar. The results showed a small booth at the Alberta Square Craft Market. The photo was grainy, but he recognized the stitching on a fabric tote, each precise thread exactly like the handkerchief Sophie still kept. Leaning back in his chair, he drew a deep breath. There was nothing holding him in Telluride now. He closed the laptop, took his coat from the hook, and paused only once, turning to look at the fireplace one last time. "Wait for me, Hannah. I'm coming to find you. If you knew exactly where the person you missed was, would you go right away? Or wait for the perfect moment? Why?" Chapter 9. Found October in Portland turned the maples into flames of gold and amber. The air carried a chill, but not enough to hurry the weekend crowds at Alberta Square. The craft market pulsed with quiet life fabric stalls, scented faintly of new cotton, the rich edge of tanned leather, and the warm, drifting aroma of fresh roasted coffee. Caleb stepped into the square hands deep in the pockets of a dark gray coat. He didn't scan the crowd. He walked straight ahead, his gaze moving slowly over each booth. His heartbeat was different. Not the sharp, quick thrum of sealing a multi-million-dollar deal, but a slow, weighted rhythm, thick with the pull of something he wanted and feared in equal measure. And then he saw it. A small wooden sign, hand-carved, Thread and Grace. The booth sat at the far end under a white canopy, displaying fabric totes, hand-stitched scarves, and neatly folded swatches of embroidery, like the pages of a book. Hannah was there. She wore a cream sweater, her hair swept into a loose bun, a few strands catching in the wind. In her hands, a canvas bag half finished, her needle moving in patient, steady lines. The set of her mouth, the focus in her eyes, exactly as he remembered from that afternoon in Telluride when she sat mending Sophie's coat as snow fell outside. Caleb stopped only a few steps away. For a moment, he wanted to call her name, but his feet stayed rooted as if holding him in the last seconds where he could just look. For months, he had replayed this meeting in his mind. But no version had been this real, where he could hear the rustle of maple leaves in the wind, smell coffee from the next booth, and see the golden wash of autumn light drape across her shoulders like an embrace in his place. If you found the person you'd been searching for, would you call their name right away? Or wait just to look a little longer? Why? Hannah glanced up when a shadow fell across her table. For a moment, her eyes widened as though refusing to believe what they saw. Caleb. He stood there, the wind tugging lightly at his coat, his gaze fixed on hers. It wasn't the gaze of a CEO giving an order or making an assessment. It was the gaze of a man who had carried an empty space for months and had just found the one thing that could fill it. She set the bag down, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why?" Caleb stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "I lost you and realized I had nothing." Her fingers curled around the edge of the table as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The words were simple, unpolished, but they landed squarely against the walls she had built around her heart. "I'm not something you lose and come back to, Caleb." Her voice was slow but firm. "I know." His reply was immediate, his eyes unflinching. I'm not here to drag you back into the past. I'm here to ask if I can start again the right way. Around them, the market kept moving, voices haggling over prices, the hiss of the espresso machine, someone laughing 2 stalls away. But between them lay a thin, fragile space, and an invisible thread pulled taut, waiting for the smallest touch to set it trembling. If someone who once hurt you said, "I want to start again the right way," would you give them the chance? Why? Hannah drew a breath, steadying her voice. You think all you have to do is show up, say a few words, and everything goes back to how it was? Caleb shook his head, taking another step closer, his tone dropping into something that felt like confession. No. I know some things can't be erased. But I also know there are things that, if I let them go, I'll never forgive myself. His gaze locked on hers, nothing hidden. I used to think you were only part of Sophie's life. But when you left, I realized you were the one who made that place a home. The words tilted something inside her. She had spent months learning how to stand on her own, building a life that didn't lean on anyone. But the memories came his eyes that morning in the library, the way he listened when she spoke about the app, the night he laid a heavier blanket over her and Sophie without a word. She turned slightly as if to keep him from seeing the crack in her resolve. I've found my life here. I don't know if there's room in it for you. He didn't step closer, but his voice held. I'm not here to take anything away. I'm here to ask to stay. Something in her chest shifted like the smallest fracture in a wall, just enough for light to find its way in. If someone said, I'm not here to take, I'm here to stay, would you believe them? Why? Hannah looked down at her hands, her fingers still tangled in the green thread from the bag she'd been working on. She rolled the spool lightly, letting silence sit between them. Caleb, it's taken me a long time to learn how to stand on my own. Her voice was quiet now, not cold, but careful. I'm afraid if I let you in, it'll all break the way it did before. He nodded, not interrupting. I understand. That's why I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I'm asking to start again, one step at a time, at your pace. When she looked up, he didn't see the locked door he'd faced when she left Telluride. Instead, he saw something in between, half-guarded, half-reaching. I'm not promising anything, she said, a fleeting smile brushing her lips. But I'm not telling you to go either. He drew a slow breath, as if the smallest opening was enough to hold on to. He stepped back, not pushing further. Then I'll stay in Portland for a while, to prove I'm really here this time. She nodded once, lowering her eyes back to her stitches, but the needle trembled faintly in her fingers. Not from the cold, but from knowing she had just opened a narrow space for him to step through. If you're not ready to forgive, but you don't want to lose someone again, would you let them come closer bit by bit, or keep the distance safe? Chapter 10. The Choice and the Proposal. April had arrived in Portland. The maples that framed Alberta Square were bursting with fresh green leaves, swaying gently in the soft spring breeze. The air carried the faint, rich scent of coffee from the market stalls, mingling with the low hum of street musicians setting up for the day. Thread and Grace had grown into more than just Hannah's little corner of the market. Sometimes Sophie, now at home in this lively rhythm, would sit on the small wooden stool beside her, clutching a spool of pink thread, embroidering on a scrap of fabric the way she'd seen her mother do. Passers-by always stopped to smile at the sight of her. And then there was Caleb. He never took over Hannah's work, but every weekend without fail, he appeared, 2 hot lattes in hand, one for her and one for him. When the stall was busy, he packed orders or kept an eye on Sophie, sometimes lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the market from way up high. At first, Hannah let him stay only for Sophie's sake, but slowly she began to realize mornings with him there felt lighter, less to worry about. Warmer somehow. Caleb wove himself into the smallest routines, turning each tote so the embroidery faced outward, wiping down the wooden counter before they opened, reminding Hannah to drink water when she got lost in her stitching. No grand gestures, no sweeping speeches, just steady presence day after day. And that, more than anything, had become part of Thread and Grace, and part of Hannah and Sophie's life. If someone never says I love you out loud but quietly shows up for you in every small way, would you believe they're truly here to stay? One soft morning, the scent of lilacs drifted in from the planters lining the market's entrance. Hannah was bent over a new display of totes when Sophie tugged her sleeve. "Mom, I'm thirsty." Hannah was about to say just a minute when she saw Caleb approaching from the coffee stand, already holding a small bottle of water. He twisted the cap off and handed it to Sophie with a gentle, "Here you go. Don't let yourself get too thirsty." Sophie took it with a grin, settling back on her little stool, her legs swinging. It was nothing dramatic, just a man remembering to bring a drink for a little girl between 100 other tiny market distractions. But for Hannah, it was a sign as clear as sunlight. Caleb wasn't here as a guest passing through. He was living inside the fabric of their everyday. She thought back to Telluride, to the cavernous quiet of the Whitmore house, where even footsteps seemed to echo too loud. And here was Caleb, now standing among the happy clamor of the market, adjusting the display of totes, leaning down to ask Sophie if she wanted a waffle. Without meaning to, Hannah smiled. She realized something family didn't always start with blood or papers. Sometimes it began the day someone chose to stay, again and again. When was the moment you realized someone had truly become part of your family? For weeks, Caleb arrived a little earlier than Hannah expected. He claimed he was taking a walk before the crowds, but in truth he was slipping away to meet the leather worker at the corner booth, a man known for crafting the most intricate little treasures in Alberta Square. One Saturday morning when Hannah opened the stall, Caleb wasn't by the counter as usual. He came from the coffee shop instead, his hand tucked in the pocket of his coat, eyes carrying a quiet kind of anticipation. By the following week, the first truly warm day of spring, he was ready. Hannah was chatting with a regular when Sophie's voice rang out, "Mom, look what Caleb's doing." She turned. Caleb was standing in front of the stall, dropping to one knee on the cobblestone path. In his hand wasn't a velvet box, but a delicate circle made of thread framed in fine fabric, stitched in red letters. "I choose you." Sunlight angled through the white canopy overhead, catching the threads and making them glimmer gold. Caleb looked up at her, voice deep and certain. "Hannah Sullivan, I can't promise there won't be hard days, but I promise this: every morning I wake up, I will choose you. This time, and every time after." The sounds of the market seemed to fade. Hannah looked at the ring. No diamonds, no gold, just thread. The same thread that had carried her from a little orphan girl sewing to feel useful to a woman who'd stitched a whole new life with her own hands. Her eyes filled not from surprise, but from the weight of being known down to her roots. If someone proposed with a gift that carried the whole story of your life inside, would you say yes? Hannah's hand rose to cover her mouth, holding back a sob. Around them, customers had begun to pause. Neighbors, vendors, strangers, each falling quiet as they took in the scene. Caleb stayed there on one knee, not rushing her, not pressing for an answer, just waiting. From her stool, Sophie leaned forward, whispering, just loud enough, "Say yes, Mom." Hannah let out a trembling laugh through her tears. She stepped around the counter, standing before him. Her fingers brushed the embroidered ring, feeling the softness of each stitch. "Yes," she whispered, but it was enough. Caleb heard. Everyone heard. Applause broke out. Someone whistled. The waffle vendor cupped his hands and called, "Congratulations." Caleb rose, pulling her into an embrace that held every lost day between them, and every day yet to come. Sophie darted in, wedging herself between them until they were one tangled circle of arms and laughter and wet eyes. No roses, no aisle. Just a spring morning at a craft market surrounded by the people who had watched Hannah rebuild her life. And for her, that made it perfect. If a proposal happens in the place that saw you change the most, surrounded by the people who witnessed it, would you call that the perfect place? The applause didn't fade right away. Some regulars lingered, buying an extra tote or scarf to celebrate. A flower seller brought over a bundle of yellow tulips, murmuring, "For your special day." Hannah smiled her thanks, glancing over at Caleb, who had Sophie perched on his shoulders. They shared a look, and in it was the quiet knowledge that the space between them had truly closed. That day, Hannah didn't just sell fabric and thread, She sold the story again and again when customers asked about the embroidered ring on her finger. And every time she told it, she heard herself say in different words, "I stayed." By late afternoon, when the market thinned, Caleb helped her pack the stall. They walked home beneath the canopy of budding trees, Sophie's small hand swinging between theirs, humming a little tune to herself. Hannah glanced at Caleb. He caught her eyes, said nothing, only tightened his grip around her hand. And in the warm Portland dusk, she knew this time it wasn't a fragile beginning. It was a choice, theirs. Sometimes home isn't a place at all. It's the moment you know someone will choose you, every single day. Do you believe family isn't built by blood, but by the choice to stay day after day, share your story? 6 months later, the little house on the edge of Portland was always filled with morning light. The windows opened to a garden lined with lavender, its scent drifting softly into every room. Hannah stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly, where a new life was quietly growing. Outside on the porch, Caleb tended to the plants, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, sunlight spilling across his shoulders. Sophie darted across the yard singing to herself, her laughter ringing through the air like wind chimes in summer. One evening they sat together at the wooden table beneath a trellis of flowers, the last light of the day weaving gold through the leaves above them. Sophie looked up at her mother, her eyes curious. "Mom, why do you smile when no one's saying anything?" Hannah's gaze lingered on her daughter for a moment, then drifted toward Caleb. He caught her eyes, returning a smile, one that carried the quiet certainty of a man who knew he had chosen right and would keep on choosing every single day. She bent down, kissed Sophie's forehead, and whispered, "Because there was a time I had nothing, and now I have everything." And in that moment, Hannah knew her old scars would always remain, but now they were part of a greater story. A story she once believed could never have a happy ending, but somehow, against all odds, it had found one. Do you believe someone who was once abandoned can still find a place to belong forever? Share the story or moment that changed your life. If this journey touched you, leave a rating from 1 to 10 and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of healing and love.